So, in the past decades, two areas of research have triggered increasing attention from scholars. And these two areas are epistolography and network analysis, which were used for a variety of contexts in historical studies. My present research, which is a work in progress, finds itself at the confluence of these two disciplines. And in the following, I would like to first give you an introduction, some theoretical considerations about network analysis and epistolography. And in the second part, I would like to give you some considerations about the letter collections of the Cappadocian Fathers, about how concepts of network analysis are applied for researching these letter collections, and to give you some of my findings. The term network has been used in historical studies in various approaches, such as social networks. The most challenging approach is the multidisciplinary one, consisting in using quantitative tools or structural analysis, so mathematics, for historical studies. One can admit that historical network analysis, at least in the subfield of Byzantine studies, has been applied first by Margaret Mulet, who used concepts of network analysis for the study of the letter collection of Theophylact of Ohrid. Almost a decade later, Adam Shore analyzed the social network of Theodoret of Cyrus based on his letter collection. More recently, my former colleague from the Central European University, Daniel Knox, has elaborated a thesis on the social network of Phenodius of Pavia, which he is currently continuing for his PhD studies. And just a few months ago, a companion to Byzantine epistolography edited by Alexander Rile includes a comprehensive study of Johannes Preiser-Capeller on letters and network analysis. The significance of using network analysis in historical studies lies not only in determining the ties between individuals, but also in assessing the organization of the ties and the positions of the actors within one network. And as Johannes Preiser-Capeller explains, one central aim of network analysis is the identification of these structures of social relations which emerge from the sum of interactions and connections between individuals within a group or society, and at the same time influence the scope of the actions of everyone entangled in such relations. Thus, what network analysis does is to collect categories, intensity, frequency, and dynamics of interactions and relations between individuals in a way which allows for further mathematical analysis. The reason for assuming such an approach is well explained also in the introduction of Borgatti of the volume Understanding Social Networks, introduction which says, networks are a way of thinking about social systems that focus our attention on the relationships among the entities that make up the system, which we call actors or nodes. Thus, the actors correspond to the vertices of a matrix. The nodes have characteristics called attributes, and the relationships among them, which also have characteristics, are called ties, links, or edges. The representation of a group of nodes and ties is called a graph. Since for networks of people, vertices, nodes, and edges are not suitable terms, sociologists apply a different terminology from other network analysts. Instead of vertices, sociologists use the term actors, while the edges between actors are called ties. Since the research focuses on human subjects in this case and draws on the methodology of social networks, I will always refer further to actors and ties. The actors of the following networks of the Cappadocian Fathers Letters Collections represent either individuals or groups of people, communities, encountered in the correspondence of them. The ties represent epistolary or social interactions between the actors, and in general, ties can represent relationships between actors. Two other parameters characterize social situations. Attribute data pertain to the attitudes, opinions, and behavior of agents, so far as these are regarded as the properties, qualities, or characteristics that belong to them as individuals or groups. Relational data, on the other hand, codify relationships, contacts, and interactions between actors, and they are represented by ties. The tie of the network codify two acts of communication. The first act is the action of sending a letter to an addressee. The second act is the action of mentioning an actor in a letter. Therefore, actors of these networks are either the addressees of the letters or the so-called third parties, which are those individuals or communities to whom the sender refers. Addressing a letter to an actor was a public act. For the Cappadocian Fathers in particular, it was meant either to create relationships, for instance, to introduce an individual to a friend, to ask for a certain favor for a friend, for example, exemption from paying taxes, to promote, to instruct, to praise, to criticize, to complain, or in general to influence. Mentioning an individual in a letter was also an act publicly intended. The relationships envisioned were either those between the Cappadocian Fathers and the addressee of a letter, or between the recipient and those mentioned in the letter. All this data is further collected in matrices, from which graphs are drawn. The graphs are not only used for visualizing the networks, but also for implementing mathematical operations on them from graph theory and matrix algebra. Social network analysis, in fact, first developed within the research field of sociology, and scholars have used increasingly difficult mathematical operations for the analysis of large-scale networks. For this particular case of the Cappadocian Fathers Letter Collections, from the various approaches for network delimitation, I will be using the so-called ego networks. More precisely, for each of the Cappadocian Fathers, I am surveying his collection of letters, gathering data about the individuals or communities mentioned there, about the chronology, wherever a chronological delimitation is possible, and about the localities, whenever there is evidence for the places from which letters were written or were sent. The so-called first-order zone includes the addressees of the letters, whereas the third parties form the so-called second-order zone. And of course, this is not the only possible approach to networks. One can also specify attributes about the links between individuals. According to the type of connections, the relations can be characterized, for example, as friendship or love, but these are terms which carry a certain tradition and their meanings change in time. Scholars have categorized network ties according to the so-called dyadic phenomena, term which defines a set of two nodes and the links established between them. Based on the categorization established by Borgatti, whom I quoted previously, and systematized by Johannes Preiser-Cappeler, these phenomena are either similarities, when two nodes share attributes such as demographic characteristics, behavior, attitudes, beliefs, locations, or group memberships. Social relations, for instance, kinship relations or friendship relations, or ties of affection such as liking, disliking, or love, or of cognitive awareness such as knowing. Interactions, which are behavior-based ties in the context of social relations such as day-to-day interaction. Borgatti characterizes these as discrete and separate events that may occur frequently but then stop, such as talking with, fighting with, or having lunch with. And finally, flows, which are relation-based exchanges or transfers of resources, information, or influence between nodes. The context of the interactions allows one to consider the so-called temporality of ties and the dynamics of networks. Relationships are established, maintained, changed, and even terminated. Sources may document the moment when an individual appears in the network and the moment when he disappears. However, the most common tools for network analysis limit the researcher only to a static model, but the temporal dynamism can still be modeled if one assesses the networks in different chronological intervals, establishing according to key moments in the development of the ego's networks. Even though the amount of information transmitted to us through the surviving sources is limited. For example, in this particular case of the Cappadocian Fathers, their surviving letters do not document all the relationships which they established or maintained over their lifetimes. The relational data found is still relevant. In general, letter collections were transmitted after one or several editorial works, as we will see in the following minutes, and sometimes this editorial work began by the author himself, which fact shows which ties the author considered relevant and representative. Once the data was collected, various applications, some of them available for free, such as UCINet, provide with tools for a structural analysis of it. This analysis has three main levels, which Johannes Preiser-Capeller presents systematically. The level of the single note is the degree of a note. One of these is the degree of a note, which counts the number of the direct links of a note to other notes. The relative centrality of a node assesses its position on path between nodes otherwise unconnected. The so-called betweenness represents the potential for intermediation. And here is an example of this concept, how Gregory, the third Gregory, I am using these labels, this numbering, because many of the names are repeating, can reach the rest of the networks only through Nicoboulos, or through Gregory of Nazianzus. This is part of the network corresponding to the letter collection of Gregory of Nazianzus. The eigenvector is the centrality of a node due to its connections to highly central nodes, for example, having a high number of connections. So an indirect centrality for a node less well connected. This identifies those who may be only a few, those who knew only a few, but the right people. The level of groups of nodes define dyads, which can be null if there is no link existent between two nodes. Directed dyads or asymmetric if an interaction leads from one node to the other. For example, if actor A sends a letter to actor B. Symmetric, which defines actions leading in both directions. For example, actors A and B exchange letters. Unweighted dyads, when a dyad's value is 0 if no link exists between the two nodes of it, or has a positive value otherwise, usually codified with 1. Weighted, when the quantity of an interaction matters, for example, the number of letters exchanged between actors A and B. Scholars also analyze triads, which are sets of 3 nodes as well. A triadic closure, for example, concludes if A is friend with actor B and actor C, then there is a high probability that actor B becomes friend with actor C through the intermediation of A, who recommends B to C in a letter. The level of the entire network, the size, represents the number of nodes. The diameter of the network is the maximum distance between two nodes, so the number of links necessary to find the path between two actors. The average distance or path length between two nodes, the density, which indicates the ratio of possible links actually present in a network. Theoretically, all nodes in a network could be connected to each other. In the particular case of the Cappadocian Fathers Letter Collections, it only makes sense to compare the density of Basil's and Gregory of Nazianzus networks, since they are of comparable sizes. We will see that the network of Gregory of Nyssa is not of comparable size, much more reduced compared to the network of Basil and of Gregory of Nazianzus. Density is the one which indicates the cohesion of a network. And one needs to be aware of the fact that the distance does not actually measure the physical distance between the actors, but only the distance within the network. The Cappadocian Fathers have ties with all the individuals part of their epistolary networks. However, the ties between them and the individuals or communities mentioned only in the letters were intentionally left out from the network model because these connections have a minimal significance. And in this way, the models would have been extremely crowded. Thus, the models are more easily to interpret. The graphs which model the networks are constructed based on a so-called affiliation matrix, which is a square matrix that records all the actors and ties. A square matrix is a matrix in which each axis contains the same set of variables. In this particular situation, I built 3 affiliation matrices, each one corresponding to one of the Cappadocian Fathers collection of letters. The axes of the matrices contain the names of the persons or the communities who either received or are mentioned in the letters. This type of matrix encodes the affiliations that actors share, but does not measure qualities that individuals possess. The matrix is not symmetrical since the ties between actors are not reciprocated. Therefore, the graphs which are constructed based on these affiliation matrices are oriented graphs, which means that the direction of a tie from an actor towards another actor matters. In order to analyze and visualize the data in the affiliation matrices, I am using a tool which is available for free, which is called UCINet. This is a piece of network analysis software which records the matrices and provides not only visualization tools, but also generates values of other parameters, and we will introduce through the development of this talk the other parameters. One needs to underline that in the graphs, the length of the tie between actors does not represent the physical distance, as I mentioned. And within the graph visualized, one can adjust the position just for a clearer representation of the information. The physical distance between the sender of letters and the recipients, or between the addressees and the actors mentioned in the letter, cannot be determined always because some letters do not mention the place where they were written. Thus, the physical location will not be part of this representation. The letters of the Cappadocian Fathers were written within a chronological span which will not be represented in the graph either. Instead, for critical years in the composition of letters, some special corresponding graphs can be constructed and visualized. In terms of distance, we will use this parameter, as I said, just in order to define the number of ties between 2 actors. When the number of ties increases, the distance increases as well. The length of ties in the graph representation has thus no significance for the interpretation. One needs to remark, finally, that these graphs are all single node graphs. Like the affiliation matrices, they visualize a single type of data, that is actors and ties, without comparing their other attributes. Now, starting the second part of this talk, I would like to introduce you one by one the Cappadocian Fathers epistolary networks. We will start with the network of Basil of Caesarea. This letter collection is probably the most difficult to approach due to the size and the difficulties in establishing the unauthentic letters, the addresses, and the chronology of some epistles. The most recent studies of the entire collection belong to Andrew Galwitz and Anna Silvas. There are 2 basic critical editions of the letters, one of Roy de Ferrari published by Loeb and one of Yves Courton published in Belles Lettres. There are 2 English translations without many differences between them or between the notes. There is one French translation in the same critical edition that I mentioned. There is also one German translation. There is one Romanian translation. And there is also a critical edition published by an Italian scholar, but this only groups the first 41 letters of Basil, which correspond to the period before his election as Archbishop of Caesarea. The modern corpus of letters was established in more or less its current form by the Benedictine editors of Saint Maur, Julien Garnier and Prudentius Marin. Garnier collected the letters and Marin ordered them based on previous studies of Louis-Sébastien Lenain de Tillemond's memoir, which was published, and this study was published in 1730. This is the basis of the studies of Basil's letters up to this day. Marin also published a monograph on the life of Basil, but the chronology of the letters has been challenged, and disputes about the authenticity of many of the letters in the collection are still taking place. Paul Jonathan Fedwick, who according to Ana Silvas instituted a revolution in the approach to the transmission of Basil's letters, considers 29 of them spurious and 6 being dubious. Briefly, the chronology of the letters was established as follows. The first 46 letters were written before 370 when Basil became a bishop. Then up to letter 291. These are letters dating from his episcopacy. As you see, these are most of his letters. And finally, from epistle 292 to 366, these are letters which cannot be dated, and as we will see further, many of these are not even authentic. But this brief chronology, in fact, is more nuanced because the authenticity and the chronology of some letters have been object of scholarly debates. Jean-Paul Migne augmented the chronological collection of Garnier and Marin, and he published altogether 366 letters. The foundation for a critical edition was laid by Abbe Marius Bessières. His study, published posthumously between 1919 and 1922 with the introduction of Turner, includes the stemma that would be assumed by the following editions as well. Bessières divided the manuscript into 2 branches. Branch A consists of 3 families titled A, AB, and AC, while branch B consists of 4 families titled BO, BU, BX, and BZ. AA has the largest numbers of witnesses and contains the manuscript with the oldest collection, which is the 10th century parchment Patmos 57. Based on the order of the letters, Bessières argues that AA family, which contains only 273 letters, is the most primitive and is the sole source for other families. But in 1944, the Swedish scholar Anders Kavalan was the first to address questions of authenticity, and he demonstrates that Basil was not the author of several letters, among which the so-called Epistle 38 on the distinction between ousia and hypostasis, which is authored by Gregory of Nyssa. 9 years later, another Swedish scholar, Stig Rudberg, published his Études sur la tradition manuscrite de Saint Basile, based on the previous studies of Bessières and Kavalan, and he identifies 9 more manuscripts and accredits about 35 codices without, though, altering the previous stemma. In 1957, Yves Courton started to publish a critical edition and the French translation. He made a judicious selection of the codices, but he did not use all of them, and for this fact he was criticized. He used the Benedictine chronological arrangement of the letters, but he did not address questions of authenticity, and it is an inexplicable fact that he accepted letter 45, for example, which is certainly dubious. In 1983, Marchela Forlin Patruco published a critical edition of the first pre-episcopal letters of Basil, and in 1992, a study that challenges the authenticity, the attribution, the addressees, and the chronology of the letters was the magnum opus of Robert Pochet, Basile le Grand et son univers ami d'après sa correspondance. And finally, Paul Jonathan Fedwick dedicated one volume of his monumental Bibliotheca Basiliana Universalis to Basil's letter collection. He has a different approach, which Ana Silvas calls a revolution, and we will see in the following why. Bessières stated that of the 273 letters of the family AA, only the first 100 appear in this order, which fact suggests that the editor of those 100 letters simply placed them in the order that he found. But from letter 101, letters are grouped by addressee, this means that, for instance, the first 4 corresponds to Sophronius, then the next 3 corresponds to a correspondence between Basil and Libanius, and so on. Bessier suggested that these first 100 letters of AA might be the same as the letters which were first sent by Gregory of Nazianzus to Nicobulus. We will see further more information about this act of sending. Rudberg, however, thought that they might be represented by the ontology in family BX. Fedvig set out arguments for his own arrangements and his new system of nomenclature. He does not agree with Bessier's criteria of classification, and he uses instead the text families established by Gallet, who investigated the letter collection of Gregory of Nazianzus. Gallet researched also the transmission of Basil's letters because some manuscripts also contain letters of Gregory of Nazianzus. And he supported that AA does not have priority, but family AB. Bessier conjectured that the editor of AA was Gregory of Nazianzus, who is the first external witness for a letter collection of Basil's letters. However, this supposition is not provable. Fedvig used a set of 5 criteria to reclassify the manuscript families for the letters in the following order. The first criterion is the internal evidence of textual variants, then the titles, then the order of the letters, then the omission of one work, and then the inclusion of a rare work. Fedvig disagreed with Bessier's claim that the editor responsible for the family AA, which Fedvig relabels as EC, was neutral, since he used more elaborate titles for the letters than did the editor of AB family, which Fedvig argues is more primitive and retitles it EA, since their letters are arranged by addressee. And Fedvig argues, a more plausible suggestion than that of Bessier, that is that initially all the letters existed in batches. That is, Basil kept in his files letters addressed to the same correspondents together. Undoubtedly, some of his correspondents, like Eusebius of Samosata and Gregory of Nazianzus, also kept copies of these letters together. In my opinion, it was the author of EC, so of Bessier's AA, who dismembered these blocks, and not that of EA, that is of Bessier's AB, who put them back together. In other words, corpus EA stems from the simple, almost mechanical assembling of scattered lots, whereas EC originates from a desire to choose some of the letters. Fedvig also states that after Basil's death, but before the compilation of the collection found in the EA family, the letters circulated in lots. That is, all of Basil's available letters to Eusebius of Samosata would have circulated together, and all those apparently to Libanius in a separate collection, and so on. As for the EC family, Fedvig states that because the author of EC has been editing the titles, here as well he's following some obscure plan, perhaps based on the contents of the specific letters. Both Fedvig and Ana Silvas propose a rewriting of the letter collection based on the same principle, and Ana Silvas goes even further by suggesting that Basil himself made a copy of what he considered as being the most important letters, and I quote from her, "It seems obvious that so good an administrator as Basil, and one not entirely careless of legal realities, kept an archival copy of his letters that dealt with controversial political and doctrinal matters, or letters that were appeals to government officials. It seems likely, therefore, that some considerable body of letters is to be sourced in his chancery in Caesarea. Such a core of letters is not exactly an authorial collection in the sense of an epistolarion deliberately put together for literary and or autobiographical purposes, as for example with Gregory of Nazianzus, we will see further. The copies kept in Basil's chancery archives were primarily motivated by pragmatic considerations. They were an insurance against the misuse and interpolation of his letters for polemical purposes by those hostile to him, and the causes he represents. In any case, the first testimony concerning the circulation of letters authored by Basil appears during his lifetime. Basil himself writes that his followers, the followers of Eustathius of Sebastia, who contested Basil's Trinitarian doctrine, published earlier letters between Basil and Apollinarius of Laodicea. In his letter 129, he states that the problem was not Apollinarius' heresy, but the fact that the Eustathians accused him of being a crypto-Sabellian. Basil defends himself by accusing his opponents of having invented a Sabellian phrase which does not distinguish between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit in order to blame Basil. Up to this date, scholars debate the authenticity of letters which are numbered 361 to 364, apparently addressed by Basil to Apollinarius in his early years before his episcopate. It is impossible to determine whether these are the letter exchange between Basil and Apollinarius, but it is clear that the correspondence with Apollinarius existed from the period dated prior to Basil's episcopacy. In any case, in my study, I am considering that a letter exchange between the two existed, but I am taking these particular letters from 361 to 364 as not authentic, following the arguments of scholars relying on internal evidence. Another translation of the entire letter collection of Basil of Caesarea, as I said, belongs to Theodor Bogdoaie, and he adds a significant amount of footnotes and information about the characters, the actors mentioned in these letters. So from the entire collection of the 366 letters which were transmitted up to this date, the following were considered for the network analysis. I am listing them in this table. And this is a visualization of the graph representing the epistolary network of Basil of Caesarea. It is not easy to see all the actors in this network because there are so many, but Basil is identified here in the middle with yellow. Altogether, the number of actors in this network are 283, and based on the tools offered by UCINet, it is possible to compute some values. The first values that were computed were their centrality values. As I was saying, centrality is a measure indicating to what extent an actor has ties to other actors in the network. If an actor has many ties to other actors, he has a high degree of centrality than actors who have few ties. Here, because we have a directed graph, we can calculate, compute in degree centrality and out degree centrality. Undirected centrality is the sum of an actor's ties divided by the sum of the possible ties in a network, but directed centrality is expressed in these two parameters: in degree centrality, which is the inner ties, the number of the inner ties of an actor, that is, it reflects the extent to which that actor is the recipient of a letter, and the out degree centrality reflects to what extent an actor sends ties to other actors. In this case, either an actor writes a letter or he is tied to another letter through the intermediary of a letter. These measures reflect the role that actors play in the working of a network. Centrality is calculated by identifying the number of other actors that an actor is tied to and comparing this as a ratio to the total number of actors within the network. And I would like to show you the first three actors, the most central three actors in this network in terms of their out degrees, who are, of course, Basil, but also Eusebius of Samosata and Meletius of Antioch. Now, as far as betweenness is concerned, the values computed by UCINet show the situation illustrated in this table. We see that Eustathius of Sebastia is one of the most recurrent intermediate here, but also Amphilochius of Iconium and Gregory of Nazianzus. In the early 380s, going now to the letter collection of Gregory of Nazianzus. In the early 380s, Gregory's grandnephew Nicobulus began his rhetorical training in Caesarea, where he would learn to possess the so-called eloquence. This fact proved to be a central event in the organization of the letter collection of Gregory of Nazianzus. The curriculum covered for Nicobulus, among other subjects, covered also advanced epistolary style. So between mid 382 and early 384, Nicobulus asked Gregory to send him letters to serve as pedagogical models. And Gregory accepted this Herculean challenge, as he terms it, and replies that he would collect as many epistles as he could. So epistles 52 and 53 in his collection disclose the way in which Gregory arranged these letters, which then he sent to Nicobulus. In the epistle 52, he describes the collection as, I quote, something expedient for eloquence and for his signature style that is connecting his letters with instructive maxims and precepts. The collection also implicitly offered Nicobulus the opportunity of inherit Gregory's style. And I quote from the letter, just like in a legitimate child, the father always appears in eloquence, no less than parents in bodily characteristics for the most part. Well, such are my features. Besides, Gregory gives Nicobulus a theoretical treatment of proper epistolary style, which is in his letter 51, letter which is placed in the beginning of the collection that he sends him. In letter 53, Gregory presents himself as a close friend of Basil of Caesarea, and he states that he sent Nicobulus some of Basil's letters as well. Nicobulus is confused by the letters of Basil that Gregory appended, and to his confusion, Gregory replies, "Since I've always preferred the great Basil to myself, even if the opposite would have seemed true to him, still now I prefer him because of the truth no less than because of our friendship. Therefore, I offer my epistles with his set down first. For I also desire that we be linked with each other in every way, while simultaneously providing a model of measure and moderation to others." The collection of Gregory of Nazianzus consists of 245 extant letters, some of which make reference to yet other situations in which Gregory had written. Besides his own letters, Gregory sent to Nicobulus, as I said, some of Basil's letters. And the choice was not accidental, because Gregory wanted to promote himself as Basil's old friend. And besides all this, Basil had passed away for almost 5 years, and Gregory was the author of an oration in which he presented Basil as a saint. In modeling this letter collection, I also included Basil's letters to which Gregory gathered and sent to Nicobulus. The letters of Gregory have been analyzed and retranslated very recently by Bradley Storin, who also made the prosopography of Gregory of Nazianzus' epistles. According to his considerations, the authentic letters are the ones listed in this table. And besides all these, the letters 101, 102, and 202 are so-called theological letters, but here no addressee is mentioned because they are in fact transmitted as orations. This is why they will not be included in the network analysis. All the letters date between the late 350s and mid 380s and correspond to certain periods in which Gregory's professional life and they address more than 90 men and women in Cappadocia, Asia Minor, Armenia, Caucasus, Constantinople, and Antioch. Not all of them can be dated with accuracy, and altogether the network consists of 127 actors. Bradley Storin remarked that this is the earliest author-designed letter collection surviving among Greek literature. Gregory of Nazianzus had also 85 different individual addressees, out of whom one is also the community in Sanabode, and 3 other groups of people, communities of heretics or administrators, decurions, or just groups of monks and nuns are also referenced. The only critical edition of Gregory's text are the 2 editions established by Paul Gallet. The order in which he presents the letters does not reflect Gregory's original arrangement. Gallet follows the 16th and 17th century Benedictine editors of the Congregation of Saint-Maur up to letter 244, and then he adds 4 post-Maurist letters. There are 6 main manuscript families, but the Maurist supposed chronological arrangement differs drastically from the collection's arrangement in these. Extrapolating from letter 53, the manuscript families seem to abide by an organizing principle at work in Gregory's original collection. To varying degrees of success, each manuscript family has in common a principle similar to Basil's earliest family manuscript identified by Fedvik. In this case, too, the families are in fact small dossiers of letters organized on batches according to a given addressees. For instance, there is a group of letters to Nectarius of Constantinople in one dossier, and then the letters of addressed to Palladius, and so on. Storin showed that some families of manuscripts are organized in the way that I said. The family age begins with the epistolary dossier of epistle 51 to 54 to Nicobulus, and then the Basil dossier, but then devolves into organizational anarchy, and F and G do not add much to this. U, V, and D, however, have a fairly consistent organization. U and D begin with the epistolary dossier followed by the Basil dossier, and then move into other addressee-based dossier, different dossiers, whereas V does the same thing, but it positions the epistolary dossier about 3/4 of the way through the collection. U, V, and D are assumed to be the families who reflected mostly Gregory's aims. And Storin observes that a network of addressees and carriers, that is those whom Gregory recommended or for whom he interceded or on whose behalf he asked for favors, emerges, one based on relationships of patronage, kinship, friendship, and education. This is the representation of Gregory of Nazianzus' epistolary network. Gregory has the greatest indirected and directed centrality in the graph, and there are a number of ties which are reciprocated in this network, which fact shows that Gregory maintained a close relation with certain actors in this network. A central focus is Nicobulus. I titled him Nicobulus II, the son of Nicobulus I. He was the grandnephew of Gregory, and to him Gregory sent the initial collection of letters, and he wanted also to promote him as a student of well-known professors such as Stagirius, Eustochius, or Eudoxius. And this table, computed with the help of UCINet, represents the first 12 actors with the highest centrality. Here I am referring to both out centrality and in centrality. It is not surprising that one of these actors is Basil of Caesarea, another one is Olympius, and another one even Gregory of Nyssa. Another tools provided by UCINet is the arrangement of a graph according to some attributes of the nodes. And in this case, I wanted to show you a representation of the epistolary network of Gregory of Nazianzus according to the inner degree of the actors. As you can see, the labels of the actors can be represented differently. And I also wanted to show you a way of representing an epistolary network according to the strength of the ties between the actors. As you can see, the more intense exchange of letters between two actors is represented with stronger ties. And in this case, I wanted to color them differently according to the tie. In this table, I am calculated, UCI actually calculated the value of betweenness, and as it can be seen, Nicobulus is the nephew, the grandnephew of Gregory, is the one who acts most as an intermediate. But also his father, Olympius, and Theodore are intermediates in this network. The epistolary network is of Gregory of Nyssa is much reduced if we compare it to the collections that survived from Basil of Caesarea or from Gregory of Nazianzus. And the modern editions belong to Giorgio Pasquali and Pierre Maraval, and in this in both editions there are only 30 letters, but Ana Silva's translated to English 35 letters. In spite of this fact, it is more difficult to determine the original status and the purpose of the letter collection of Gregory of Nyssa. The manuscript transmission of these letters is another difficulty because some of the letters have a contested attribution, while some others are attested in very few manuscripts and not very reliable. Pierre Maraval, Ana Silvas, and Andrew Galwitz discussed at length these issues and sorted out the problems, so I will give you now only the conclusions. Unlike the previous authors that we surveyed, Gregory of Nyssa has some other pieces of writings whose genre can be also characterized as epistolographic. Scholars admit that the intention of Gregory was to disseminate those works as letters as well, even though the conventional literary style of letters was not entirely respected. For example, the preface to the so-called letter to the monk Olympius on the life of Macrina, commonly called the Life of Saint Macrina, opens with the following remark: as far as its type of heading goes, the genre of this book seems to be a letter, but its length, stretching to the long-windedness of a treatise, goes beyond the limit of a letter. This comment introduces the greatness of Macrina, his saintly elder sister, about whom an ordinary lengthy letter would not be able to do justice to her holiness. Gregory assumes that letters are a fixed and recognizable genre with set formulas and limits, but at the same time, he acknowledges that in this particular case, he does not apply such conventions. And indeed, its over 9,000 words exceeds the limit of a letter. However, the initial remark, backed by a similar remark in letter 19, in which Gregory promises to the same monk Olympius that he would come back with a letter about Macrina's extraordinary life, are indications that this vita is in fact the waited for response to Olympius' request. A similar situation appears in the work titled To Eustathius on the Holy Trinity. This text has not been included in modern critical editions of Gregory's letters, but it bears features of a letter, especially in its inscription and preface, even though its length is more than 2,700 words. Although it seems to be a short treatise on the Trinitarian doctrine, another detail allows one to consider it among Gregory's letters. In a shorter recension, it was transmitted as Basil's Epistle 189. But Gregory's text is also a response to a request, in this case from Eustathius the physician, with whom Basil too had corresponded in his letter 151. This Eustathius asked Gregory to clear his name on charges that were circulating against him. Another piece of writing is to Harmonius on what the Christian's profession is. Another one is to Ablabius on not thinking that we say three gods. And another one is to Peter on the difference between ousia and hypostasis. All these three are also letters, but the letter to Peter was transmitted as Basil's Epistle 38. In the last years, scholars proved the authorship of Gregory. Another piece of writing is to Simplicius on the faith, and another one is the canonical epistle to Letoius. Pieces of writing which have epistolary titles, but without prefaces. The former has been edited, included in Gregory's Opera Dogmatica Minora in Gregorii Niseni Opera, since it resembles similar works of dogmatic argument cast in the form of forensic rhetoric from the late 4th century, which prove by the use of scriptural testimonies the heretical character of some concepts. The letter is similar to Basil's three canonical letters, but it was transmitted among documents of canon law, and it does not have a preface either. Another piece of writing is to the Greeks from Common Notions. That is also part of Opera Dogmatica Minora because it explains the terms ousia and hypostasis. The addressee is vague here, and it is not clear who the audience was. The inscription of the letter suggests, though, that it was perceived as a letter. And to Theophilus, finally, against the Apollinarians, is also a piece of writing included in the Opera Dogmatica Minora. Although the French edition and the translation of Pierre Maraval followed the Pasquale's canon of 30 letters, Ana Silva, as I said, expanded the number, and he added the letters that I mentioned, and she also agrees that she could have included the life of Saint Macrina as well. From the letter collection, letters from 4 to 30 were transmitted in 3 manuscripts. And Gregory of Nazianzus' letter 238 was also attributed to Gregory of Nyssa, so it belongs to this manuscript too. But in families F and V, the letters which are included in Pasquale's collection appear among other works. Manuscript F contains 23 letters, and the letter 13, the second one listed, is followed by Gregory's Oration on Catechesis, which is followed by letter 4, which is on the 50th place in the manuscript. And after letter 4, the work to Simplicius and to Theophilus follow. Then there is the letter 21, which is followed by the work to Harmonius on what is on what the Christian's perfection is. And all these are followed by other works which are not letters. Manuscript V has 17 of Pasquale's 30 letters. First are Epistle 29 and 30, Gregory's letter to Peter about the first book of Antireticus against Eunomius, which is commonly known as his treatise against Eunomius, and also the reply of Peter. These two letters are followed by Gregory's treatise against Eunomius. Next comes Gregory of Nazianzus' letter 238, the same letter that appears in the previous manuscript that I mentioned, but in this case it does not have an author, and then the letter of the great Athanasius. Then Gregory's letter 4 appears, and it is followed by a work ascribed to Gregory of Nyssa that the Trinity is consubstantial and that there is a single deity in the 3 hypostases. And this is followed by the treatise on the inscription of the Psalms and 14 additional letters of Gregory. The copyists of manuscript F and manuscript V did not separate letters from other types of works of Gregory, which increases the difficulty of the current analysis. Besides, letters on a theme were not necessarily followed by the treatises on that particular theme. And the exception to this statement are letters 29 and 30 in manuscript V, which are followed by Gregory's treatise against eunomius. It has to be added that only letters 2, 29, and 30 are widespread and independently attested and also universally ascribed to Gregory of Nyssa. Letters 29 and 30 have a broad attestation because of their connection with the treatise against eunomius, while letter 2, in which Gregory questions the appropriateness of pilgrimages to Jerusalem, especially for women religious, has been found useful to reformers since the 16th century, but even in the Middle Ages it was widely copied. Based on the internal evidence of the letters, Anna Silvas and Andrew Galwitz drew some conclusions concerning the status of the letters during Gregory's lifetime and also shortly after Gregory's death. The transmission between letters 1 and 3 and also of letters 4 to 30 led Anna Silvas to conclude that there must have been an early compilation consisting of letters 4 to 30, and even more than that, of two primitive sub-collections within this group. According to her, the second sub-collection is shaped by style and tone, and also has a pedagogical intent. But Andrew Galwitz disagrees that literary features alone can be a basis for establishing a sub-collection. Silvas also suggests that Gregory of Nyssa might have made a similar copybook for students in the same way as Gregory of Nazianzus did for Nicobulus, but in this case, apparently Gregory of Nyssa compiled such a notebook for Cynegius, who was identified as Gregory's son. And based on letter 17, which she characterizes as formal and ecclesiastical, Anna Silva states that a copy was possibly kept in Nyssa, and she conjectures that Nyssa is where the primitive collection of Gregory of Nyssa might have been compiled. And this is how the epistolary network of Gregory of Nyssa looks like in its graphical representation. In spite of the fact that it has very few actors, some theoretical remarks can still be made. And with the help of UCINet, the centrality of the nodes in the network can be computed. And I would like to share with you this table, which presents the most central actors of this network. It is not surprising that we find here Peter of Sebastia, who was Gregory of Nyssa's brother and also supporter in his theological endeavors, and Stagirius, but also the presbyters in Nicomedia, with whom Gregory had some connections. Finally, the in and out degree as were computed in the case of the previous letter collections. These were the findings that I wanted to share with you today, and I thank you very much for your attention.